Wraith The Oblivion has had 6 major storms that have permanently altered the lands of the dead. Today I'm going to tell you what happened with each of those storms, what led up to them, and we'll talk about the last one. Hello everyone, welcome to the table. My name's Nathaniel. This is a channel where we discuss lore around some of your favorite role-playing games and mine. If that's something you're interested in, I would love to have you join me on the Discord server. You can also hit that subscribe button and the bell notification because that helps. And I'm going to tell you about my Patreon at the end of the video, so stay tuned for that. There were 6 great storms that happened that shaped the world of the dead, the Shadowlands, as well as the Skinlands. This would be what the Wraith called Earth, or the physical realm. The fall of Rome was the first major storm to happen in Wraith The Oblivion. The Black Plague followed second. The conquest of North Americas was the third. You then had World War I and the Spanish flu as the 4th Maelstrom. World War II was the 5th. And number 6 is basically happening right now. The fall of Rome happened in 476 CE. Rome was supposed to represent the height of human thought, of the nature of what humanity could achieve. However, the rapid decline of Rome and the amount of death that happened there caused a massive storm in the Tempest. And not only the Tempest, but it also caused the Labyrinth, both of these areas to create and spit out more specters than they normally would have. And these specters that were released, they possessed the barbarians who were attacking Rome and continued doing so with a much stronger vigor. And this kept the death toll going. And even when their host had died, the specters would then travel back to the Shadowlands, and upon seeing Stygia, which was formed at this point, they found a new place to attack, and so they also did this in the Shadowlands. Stygia was not prepared for this storm. The city was razed, buildings were demolished. The Onyx Tower was even damaged during this first storm. Many wraiths who were living in the city at the time were unprepared for the storm, and they did not have the proper shelter, and they ended up being destroyed. Of the surviving wraiths, their faith in Charon, who had actually built Stygia, at least from the wraith perspective, their faith in him as a protector was completely destroyed, and he had to work very, very hard with the ferrymen to rebuild that image. After this storm, Charon formed his Death Lords and essentially took power and crowned himself Emperor of Stygia. The second storm happened in 1347. This was basically the Black Plague. It was ravaging Europe. It was killing millions of people. Now, the Black Plague, in the spiritual sense, was destroying the land. It was diseasing it as well as the people. And wraiths began falling into the Shadowlands at such an alarming rate. And the storm that came from this was from the death toll and the suffering, the emotional suffering that came with this. It roiled up the sea. Some of the wraiths that came through even still had the marks of the plague itself. This time, however, Stygia held strong. Its seawall was reinforced and it held back the beating waves of the Tempest. The army that was formed was able to fight back these specters, and not only fight back the specters, but gather the new wraiths and bring them into the fold, or bring them into the city and give them a new purpose. With all his new subjects, Charon began taking a census of everyone who was living in Stygia, and he also started collecting tithes from some of the guilds, and this will become important later. I have covered this in my video on the Onyx Tower, so if you'd like to take a look at that, please check that out up here. The third great maelstrom was the conquest of the Americas, and this happened in around 1605. The destruction of the flayed lands from the renegade spirits and the heretic spirits, and this all was happening in the New World. The loss of life that was happening there was also unprecedented. The flayed lands were an entire kingdom in the Shadowlands, and when this fell, it caused the labyrinth to just erupt with specters. The response was so violent that the Sea of Shadows, which was mostly calm at this point, turned into the Tempest, and it never settled down. This caused many problems for Stygia. It effectively cut it off from the rest of the Shadowlands. The storm was so bad that even the ferrymen just stopped transporting people. The event of this effectively solidified the three factions of Wraiths. You had the Heretics, the Renegades, and then you had Charon's Free Wraiths. And he basically started arming everybody in the Free Wraiths to prevent the other groups from getting in. The fourth Great Maelstrom happened July 1st, 1916. This was basically World War I. Just enormous loss of life in this particular area called the Somme River. It was a battlefield and just an awful, horrific place to be. It caused a portal to open into the Shadowlands called a Nile, and it basically stayed open until the end of the war. Now, what's important about the Nile portals is that they connect to a very specific spot either in the Tempest or in the Labyrinth. And from these portals, specters just began pouring out of these portals. Specters were taking over European cities or European necropoli and building their own forges, their own places to take wraiths and turn them into resources. And they kept attacking the European cities, both in the Skinlands and in the Shadowlands. This was the most powerful storm on record to date. The Tempest was in such a frenzy that nobody wanted to travel it. Even the well-known byways, the areas that typically you could still use when the sea was in a fuss or a tizzy, if you will. No one wanted to go anywhere or travel anywhere. Trade shut down, and again, Stygia suffered for this. Some Wraith even lost their fetters because they were stuck on another continent, which they couldn't get to. Now, the fifth Maelstrom happened in 1945. This was at the end of World War II. This was when basically the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This Great Maelstrom was very different to the ones that came before it. There was usually a buildup that happened, but for the fifth Maelstrom, there was essentially no warning. It was just an extreme event that happened all at once. The underworld was already struggling with the sheer loss of life and the atrocities that were committed during World War II. The power of the bombs were able to pierce the shroud, and the light and the power from these particular devices, they were felt throughout the Shadowlands. And this caused the Labyrinth to just explode with specters, the violence of it. But it released more than just specters. Now, in World of Darkness, there's also some other events, some other characters who were tied into this specific event. I will have a link to a video up here for Blacktooth, who basically looked into Oblivion when these bombs went off, and it caused him to go quite mad. Now, what these bombs also did in terms of Wraith, there was a massive, giant monster called Garul. He was sleeping in the Labyrinth until the bombs woke him up. He was so powerful that any army that tried to attack him or stand against him was essentially wiped out. With some strategies and some clever distractions, Charon was able to take up a sacred blade of his and fight Garul, and he was able to send him back to Oblivion. This also cost Charon his life. And with the loss of its ruler, Stygia, the hierarchy, the Death Lords, they all fell to infighting once this Great Maelstrom had passed. The sixth Great Maelstrom, which we are technically living in right now, has actually been started from a different source. All of the other Maelstroms that happened came from events that happened in the Skinlands. The sixth Great Maelstrom happened from something specifically in the Shadowlands. As a quick side note, I also view this sixth Maelstrom as kind of the apocalypse event, no matter what game you're playing. If you're playing Wraith or if you're playing Werewolf, Vampire, this is the end of times. This is what the sixth Maelstrom represents. In 1999, Stygia was attacked. It was attacked by the Yellow Springs, it was attacked by the Kingdom of Jade, as well as the Smiling Lord who betrayed Stygia. The Stygian defenders were barely able to hang on and fend off the attackers, but they did. And to further compound things, while this was happening, while this attack was happening on Stygia, there was a void engineer in the Labyrinth who set off a relic nuclear device, and he set it off at the mouth of Oblivion. Massive spiritual and physical destruction happened in the underworld. The carnage that was happening in the labyrinth caused all of the armies in the labyrinth to leave, and they poured out. They attacked the Stygians, they attacked the Yellow Springs, they attacked the Kingdom of Jade. Anybody that they could hit, they basically did. Karen, who had been absent since 1945, ends up making a reappearance and fights off the attackers. And while all of this was happening, some very powerful Risen and Persephone were able to go through the shroud into the Skinlands. Now, the original intent for this particular storm was supposed to be the last great Maelstrom of the Wraith The Oblivion line. That was at least with it being in White Wolf's hands. We'll see what Onyx Path does with this. I know Onyx Path has done a game that sort of picks up after all of these events have happened. I just haven't really played or looked too much into it yet. What did you think of the Great Maelstroms and how they affected all of the World of Darkness, not just Wraith The Oblivion? Tell me in the comments below. I would like to thank those who have affected me and the channel, and those people would be my patrons. Autumn Alchemist, Orbs McMellans, RRSPQ, Ducky, Vox, Cane Root, War Pony, Get of Mathrocks, BA Bravo, Arutvin, The First Layer, Bones Malone, Westheimer, and Ain't No Waifu. Thank you all so much for your support for me and for the channel. If you would like to get your name on that list of patron supporters, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. Link is in the description below. If you would like to learn a little bit more about Stygia, I have a playlist for you on Wraith The Oblivion, so please check that out. My name's Nathaniel. This has been The Maple Table. Thank you so much for your subscription, and thanks for stopping by, everyone.